With me this morning is Justin Gravitt. Justin is associated with a national ministry that many of you are familiar with called the Navigators, but specifically, Justin Gravitt is the Dayton area director for the Navigators Church Ministries. Did I get that right, Justin?
Perfect.
And
Yep.
and your area of responsibility is what? Tell our listeners what kinds of things you're involved in.
Yes, so I help pastors and church leaders throughout the Dayton area with disciple making in the local church. And so our big focus is helping them develop a disciple making culture in their church.
And how do you go about doing that?
So it's a process. So I work with many lead pastors, and so to turn a culture, then we need to help the lead pastor figure out where they're going. And so as they're moving into discipleship, which a lot of churches use that word,
Right.
but there's not much clarity around what it means. And so we help the pastor figure out what that means, and then we help them figure out how to make disciples in relational contexts. A lot of times, honestly, Jim, pastors come to me looking for help with their church, and they want a disciple-making culture in their church. And I say, man, that's awesome. And I say, but let me ask you a question. Are you helping anyone else individually and relationally? And oftentimes the answer is no. And so I have to say, well, we can't have a disciple-making church until we have a disciple-making pastor.
Okay.
And so I start with them.
That makes sense. And then carry that process through. Let's say the pastor does answer it with the negative answer, no, I'm not currently discipling someone myself. Then how do you encourage that process, or how do you take the next steps?
Right. So I walk with a lead pastor 6 to 9 months, just he and I meeting together every other week, and I'm giving him disciple-making training. Now, the sad reality of pastors and what their training has been is in seminaries, they haven't had a class, they haven't had any sort of individual training in how do I make a disciple in a relational context. And so I'll ask a pastor, I'll say, well, what's the main objective of a church? Why does your church exist? And all of them say to me eventually, well, it's to make disciples, it's to have the kingdom of God expand throughout this area. And I'm so excited about that. And then I ask them a follow-up question. I say, well, tell me about the training you've had in that, at seminary, maybe other places. And I've yet to find a pastor that's had even one class at seminary on how to make disciples in a relational context.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my God. I'm sure every time you share that truth, people say the same thing I just said. Really?
Yes.
That's
It's surprising. It's really hard for pastors because pastors are seeing that the attractional church model is declining. It's declining throughout the country. And there's a report that came out just a couple weeks ago by the Pew Institute that those who identify themselves as Christians is down 12% over the past 10 years.
Yeah.
And the reality is it's a disciple-making problem. And so if a pastor sees the main job of the church is to make disciples, they see the church is in decline, they haven't had any real training in how to make a disciple,
Yeah.
put yourself in their shoes. That's a really hard place to be.
And they're already swamped with so many responsibilities to begin with, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So talk to me about the actual process of making disciples. What is involved? How do they accomplish this goal of creating disciples in their church?
We engage the pastor. He begins to walk alongside or disciple 1 or 2 people, or maybe up to 3 or 4 in his church. And as he's working with them relationally, he sees transformation happen. Now, once I see that pastor is now a disciple maker, now the church is ready, and the pastor is normally chomping at the bit. Let's move this out. And so I say, well, let's look at 1 Thessalonians 1. What did Paul and his team do? And if you read through 1 Thessalonians 1, Paul and his team were, first of all, they were a team. They were partnered together. They cared for each other. They loved each other deeply and knew each other deeply. And they began to move into Thessalonica and modeled for the people there. And so in the same way in a local church, you need a small core team of people, not a group, a team, that will model for others what it looks like not only to be a disciple, but to relationally make disciples. And so that's kind of how it gets going. And so in the local church, so if you have a team of 8 people and they all begin discipling 1 or 2 people, that at the end of a year, you have about 16 people.
So it multiplies
It
itself.
multiplies.
Okay.
Absolutely. And so we believe that Jesus' model is the best model of disciple making. But what's happened is in the church is we've separated Jesus' teachings from his methods, and then we wonder why we're not getting his results.
Talk about that we've separated his teachings from his methods.
Yeah, so most of the time in churches when we talk about Jesus and we hear sermons about Jesus, we're focused on the Sermon on the Mount, for instance. So what did he teach us? How are we to live? And those are important things, but we often leave out, how did he do it? How did he make disciples? And what he did was he took a few. He didn't concentrate on the crowd, so he didn't ignore them. He concentrated on the few, on the 12, and really gave himself to them. And so in the Gospels, I've gone through and looked, 17 times we see Jesus with the masses. But we see him with his disciples 46 times. And so a lot of times, church, we have that kind of backwards that we think, well, we need to focus more on the crowds. Well, we think we should do what Jesus did. And when we do what Jesus did, then we get closer to the results that Jesus got through multiplying disciples generationally.
And I've heard that same concept. By the way, I'm talking with JGravitt. Justin lives and works in our area. He's the Dayton area director of Navigators Church Ministries. But that concept you were talking about of the much smaller group versus the larger group, and how you pointed out how Jesus spent the vast majority of his time here on earth in his ministry with intimate, smaller groups. I've heard that same truth expressed relating to small groups.
Our experience is that small groups don't get small enough. And so small groups are often a vehicle that gets you closer to relational disciple making. But really, if you're not in a context of one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three, then people just aren't sharing at the depth that they need to share. The level of accountability is not deep enough to see the growth that really we can get in those relational discipling contexts.
You're right, because even in a small group, someone can get lost, can't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah. If they're the kind of person that isn't prone to speak up as much as somebody else, or there's one person in the small group who tends to dominate the conversations.
Right.
Talk to me a little bit about the history of the Navigators, the larger national organization. How did this all get started?
Yeah, so the Navigators began about 85 years ago. The founder was a lumberyard worker named Dawson Trotman, who just caught a heart for the Lord, and he had a pattern in his life that he would not go to sleep on any given day without sharing the gospel with somebody. And so one night he got to bed and he's starting to go to sleep, and he realized he hadn't done it that day. And he said to himself, well, I'll just do it tomorrow. I'll do 2 tomorrow and it'll be fine. But then the Spirit checked him and said, nope, if you let it slide today, you'll let it slide tomorrow, and then, it'll just snowball. Yeah. And so he got dressed, got out, went out into his car, this out in California in the 1930s, saw a hitchhiker, picked him up. Hitchhiker gets in the car, and the hitchhiker says, or Dawson says to the hitchhiker, where are you going? And, he said, well, I'm only going as far as you are because I've been in bed tonight, and I'm here, and explained the whole thing. So they started going. Dawson shares the gospel with him. And as he's talking with the guy, he realized that he'd picked this guy up about a year before.
Oh, my.
And the year before, this guy had prayed to receive Jesus, but Dawson couldn't see any difference in the guy from one year to the next. And that really bothered him because he said, something's wrong here. He'd been using Philippians 1:6, which says, I am confident in this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion till the day of Christ Jesus. And he would pray that over the person and speed off. But he realized that he was trying to put the responsibility on God that God meant for him. And so he got a heart for disciple making. It's not just about sharing the gospel. You need to help those new infants grow in their faith so that they can reproduce themselves. And so from there, he began to work with guys from the Navy as they'd come off the ships and have Bible studies. And the first guy he worked with came to him after a few months, and he brought his friend in the Navy too. He said, Dawson, what you've been doing is so helpful for me. I got this other guy, and he wants your help too. And Dawson said, I'm not going to help him. I said, why not? And he said, well, if what I've been doing has been helpful to you, then you help him. And that was the beginning of the Navigators. The
concept of multiplying the effort, right?
Absolutely. So in the Navigators, we aim for the ripple, not the splash.
Oh, I like that.
Yes.
Aim for the ripple, not the splash. Can I use that sometime?
Absolutely.
I like that. I like that. Talking with Justin Gravitt, who is the Dayton area director of the Navigators Church Ministries. They are associated with the larger national organization called the Navigators. Justin, let me ask you this question. What would you like our listeners to know about your local efforts? Is there something or more than one thing in particular that you want to talk about this morning?
Yeah, what I'm most excited about in the Dayton area right now is about a year and a half ago, there was a group of pastors that decided that we need a network of other pastors and churches who are focused and committed doing disciple making the way that Jesus did it. And so we formed together the Dayton Disciple Makers Network. It's cross-denominational. Right now we have about 12 churches and around 20 to 30 pastors who are involved. We meet the third Thursdays of every month for lunch. And we talk about disciple making. We learn from one another and the challenges that people are facing in their churches and the things that they're learning. During the odd months, there's a formal presentation from one of our group or someone from the outside who can help us. And so if you're a pastor in the area and you're interested in learning more about that, we would love to connect with you. If you're a church leader, that would also be an appropriate thing for you. If you're just an average church member, I direct you to my website, and I would encourage you to ask your pastor, man, how are things going with disciple making? I heard about this thing on the radio, and there are these things out there in Dayton, which quite honestly, most pastors just aren't aware that we're around. But many, many pastors in Dayton and beyond are looking for help in disciple making, and we want to be able to connect to them.
And what's the best way for someone to get in touch with you, whether it's a pastor, a layperson? How do they do that?
So the best way would be to visit my website, which is www.justingravitt.com, Gravitt, and you can connect to me through there, and I'll be sure to get back to them.
And I was on your website just a few minutes ago before we started the interview. It's really nice. You've got a blog, some very interesting headlines of articles that made me want to click on them. Again, the website is Justin Gravitt, and 2 T's in his last name, Gravitt, justingravitt.com. And then for any pastor who may want to join you on that every third Thursday, was it, lunch?
Yes.
How do they also go to your website?
Yes.
Okay.
That'd be the best place. We're recording this at the end of October. Our next meeting's in November, and they move around to the different churches in our network, but our next meeting will be at Restoration Church in Centerville.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. Justin, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jim. It's been fun.
Lots of great information. Justin Gravitt, the Dayton area director of Navigators Church Ministries, doing great work here in Southwest Ohio, in the Miami Valley of making disciples. And again, his website, for any information you might want, go to Justin Gravitt, it's Gravitt with 2 T's, Gravitt.com. And I have to mention that during this whole interview, sitting right next to Justin, his beautiful 10-year-old daughter, Elise. Shove that microphone over there. Do you want to say hi, Elise?
Hello.
Ah, you've been so sweet. Justin, thank you so much. God bless you and your ministry, and I hope that our listeners are encouraged by it and that they'll reach out to you.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it.
All right.